This video and all of its contents, including any opinions expressed by the narrator, are strictly for entertainment purposes only and is not intended in any way as a substitute for professional services and consultation from a licensed therapist, doctor, attorney, or other licensed professional service provider. Each person must make their own life decisions, and those decisions are theirs. Welcome back to Find Your Alpha. I'm back at you this week with another terrific video story, and you can see the title on your screen. Man abandoned family after discovering son wasn't his. And I have this labeled as a very sad and heartbreaking story, and it is, and you'll see what I mean when we get into it. The reason why it's heartbreaking is this story is told from the perspective of the child. Now, in this case, the child now is an adult, but he's looking back and he's talking about what happened in his family and what happened to him after his father left. And to take things even to the next level in terms of sadness, you're going to see what happens at the end of the story, how this thing all turns out. Now, I don't want to give too much away right now, so let's just get into it and see what it's all about. He starts off and he says, I came here to share my story as a way to clear my mind and to possibly help others. My mother and the man I knew as my dad, who I'll be calling Phil, met when they were 18. According to my mother, they immediately fell in love. After a few months of dating, Mom found out she was pregnant and she and Phil moved in together at a home owned by my grandparents. That home is located just down the block from where my grandparents live and is where my mom still resides today. Being they were both so young, their families thought it best they not get married right away. Now that's interesting, and instead live together for a while to see how they got along. At the time, my mother was working at the mall and Phil had a job delivering appliances. So these are two very young people who kind of jumped right into life. Obviously, they don't have college degrees. They're probably working very hard at their jobs, and now they've got a child on the way. Not an ideal way to start out, but let's just go on. Even though they were both young and struggling, everyone who knew them thought them to be mature and grounded for their age. They both worked hard and were very good parents. Phil eventually obtained his CDL, and for those of you that don't know, CDL stands for Commercial Driver's License, and got a better job driving truck for a farming company in our area. While working there, he saved up enough money to put a down payment on his own truck and became an independent driver when I was 4. Well, that's great. I like to see that kind of hustle. He did this to provide a better life for us and for the freedom it provided. The only drawback was he often spent 4 to 5 days away at a time, and when he was gone, I really missed him. I hated when he left, as I always worried he wouldn't come back. Little did I know one day that would happen. To ease my mind, Phil bought me a road atlas and would map his route to show where he was going and when he'd be back. He'd also call every night from the road to tell me where he was. While talking, I'd locate the spot on the map, then calculate how many days it would be until he'd return. When he did come back, he'd always bring me something from the road. Normally it was a small souvenir or a unique candy or food item he found at a truck stop, but to me it was like gold, and I always looked forward to it. Yeah, you can get some really interesting things at those truck stops. Phil and I were as close as a father and son could be. He was a giant of a man, and I wanted to be just like him when I grew up. He and my mother also had a very close and loving relationship, and I distinctly remember them openly showing affection for each other when we were all a family. According to my grandparents, everyone thought of them as a perfect young couple. Phil was also very close to my grandparents, and they viewed him like a son. The 5 of us ate dinner together nearly every night when he was home and attended church on Sunday mornings. The situation was ideal for me, growing up in a home with 2 loving parents, with my grandparents just down the street. My life was as good as it could possibly be until about a month after my 6th birthday. That's when I started experiencing some health issues. My pediatrician ordered a bunch of tests, but everything came back fine. After doing all he knew to do, he sent me to a specialist who eventually identified what was ailing me. Thankfully, it wasn't anything chronic or life-threatening, and it was resolved with medication. However, the experience was something that would forever change our lives. While I was being put through those tests, the doctor ordered tests that required samples from both my mother and father. Uh-oh. Through those tests, it was revealed that Phil was not my biological father. Since I was so young and sick at the time, no one shared this with me, and I actually wasn't made aware of this until 5 years later. As such, I had absolutely no idea what was going on behind the scenes in our house. Thinking back now, I do remember everyone acting a little different, but nothing really stood out to me at the time. During my treatment and for the days following my recovery, Phil took time off and spent almost all of it with me. It was summer, and when I started feeling better, he either took me to the pool or fishing almost every day. He also bought me a new bike I'd been wanting, and we'd go out to lunch 3 to 4 times a week. Looking back now, those were probably the happiest days of my childhood. Little did I know it would all come to a bitter end. The last time I saw Phil was on a Tuesday late in the summer of 2005, which happened to be my first day of school in the first grade. He woke me up in the middle of the night and told me he was leaving for a trip. He normally left at night, so this wasn't out of the ordinary. However, this time he said something different. He told me he'd be gone for a while and wanted me to be strong and take care of my mom and grandparents. He asked if I could do that for him, and I told him I would. I remember his eyes being red and bloodshot, but thought it was just from being so early. Before he left, he gave me a really tight hug and told me he loved me. When he pulled away in his truck, he stopped in front of the house, rolled down his window, and waved to me, then blew his horn 3 times. This was the secret signal we had when he was leaving or returning. Later that day, I went to school and couldn't wait to tell Phil about it when he called that night. When I got home, my mom was there and she told me she talked to Phil and he wasn't going to be able to call me tonight because he was busy. I suspected something right away as he had never done that. I asked my mom what he was doing and she told me he was going to be very busy with work. I remember being really disappointed by this, but thought, all right, I'll talk to him tomorrow. This happened again the following night, and my suspicions grew. I sensed my mother was hiding something from me. I asked her if something was wrong, and she told me no, everything was fine. She said Phil was just busy working. The day after that, when I got home from school, there was a big package waiting for me. It was an exact model of Phil's truck that he bought and shipped overnight to me. I remember being so excited and relieved and spent the rest of the afternoon playing with that truck. I couldn't wait for Phil to call so I could thank him and ask him when he was coming home. That never happened, and instead, later that evening, my world was shattered. While I was playing, my mom and grandparents came into my room to talk to me. It was then my grandpa told me Phil would not be coming back. I didn't understand at first and looked over at my mother for an explanation. She and my grandma were crying and I wasn't sure what was going on. My grandpa told me my mom and Phil had some differences they couldn't work out and Phil decided to leave. I thought they were all lying and believed something bad had happened to Phil as I knew he'd never do that. I started screaming at them to tell me the truth and to take me to Phil. I told them I wanted to see my dad and wanted my grandpa to drive me to him. I was inconsolable, and by this point everyone was crying. It was awful, the worst day of my life. Now put yourself in the shoes of this young kid. I mean, this had to be just decimating for him. He didn't know what was going on. They're telling him, hey, your dad left and he's not coming back. And the kid's just thinking, there's no way my dad would do that to me. He wouldn't leave me like this. This is just a terrible situation. My grandpa assured me Phil was fine, but he again told me he would not be returning home. When this finally sunk in, I was crushed, devastated, and every other similar word you can think of. I suffered extreme emotional stress, which was so severe I was kept out of school for 3 full weeks. I probably should have been taken to a counselor, but instead my family tried soothing my sorrow with love and attention, which didn't work. I blamed them for Phil leaving and was very withdrawn emotionally from everyone. So yeah, the poor kid, he doesn't know what's going on. They didn't tell him the real reason why his dad left. So he's probably thinking, hey, you guys had to do something bad to him or say something bad to him to make him leave. All I could think about was Phil. I constantly wondered where he was and what he was doing. Every time someone got a call, I thought it was him. Every truck I saw, I pictured Phil driving it, and every time I'd hear a truck's horn, I thought it was him coming home, but he never did. I couldn't understand why he left, and because I didn't know why, I started blaming myself. I lived with this terrible guilt for years until my mom eventually told me when I was 11. You see that? By trying to protect this kid and, keeping the truth from him, the kid then internalizes things and thinking, hey, this Phil must have left because he didn't like me. It must have been my fault. They should have told him the truth in an age-appropriate way. It was a shock, and I initially felt deep resentment towards my mother. I was even angry with my grandparents for keeping this from me. My birth father is a guy my mother worked with at the mall. My grandparents didn't even know she was dating him. According to my mother, they became friends and would sometimes go out to eat after closing. She said they only dated a short time as she viewed him as just a friend. It sounds like they were a little bit more than friends, more like friends with benefits. She said once she met Phil, she ended their relationship as she knew Phil was the one. My birth father doesn't know I'm his son, and I plan to keep it that way. I asked my mother not to inform him as I wasn't interested in meeting him. She was relieved to hear this as she didn't want him in our lives, even though he's apparently a decent guy. He still lives in the area with his family and works as the parts department manager for a car dealership. Now, I don't know how I feel about this. I mean, I can understand this kid, he's probably in his mind thinking, hey, Phil is my dad, and I don't want any other dad. But this guy who is the birth father, I think he deserves to know. What do all of you out there think about that? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. While my mother was the root cause of everything, I couldn't stay mad at her for long as she has always been a great mother who devoted her entire life to raising me right. The same for my grandparents. Even though I eventually accepted things and went on with life, Phil never completely left my mind. For years I'd think of him all the time, especially when I saw a kid out somewhere with his dad. Yeah, that would be tough. I'd constantly have flashbacks and it really messed me up. When I got into middle school and started playing sports, I'd daydream one day Phil would be sitting up in the stands watching me. I used to scan the crowd hoping to spot him, but of course, he wasn't there. Though I seemed like a happy-go-lucky kid on the outside, inside I struggled with a deep sadness that never really went away until I met the woman who is now my wife. Like my mother and Phil, we met and fell in love when we were young. When I say fell, I mean I fell hard, and my wife did too. We got married a few years later when we were both 21. Now, you know my feelings on that. 21, I think, is way too young to get married today, especially in today's society. Years ago, that was commonplace. I mean, you got married right out of high school a lot of times, and you started building your family and working a job, and that's how society was. But today, things are different, as we all know. We now have a 17-month-old son and a daughter on the way. Like me, my wife comes from a broken home, and her dad was mostly out of the picture. Because of this, we have a special bond and have committed to never let this happen to our family. So you can see how these two came together because they had very similar life experiences growing up. I thank God multiple times a day for bringing my wife and son into my life. Since meeting her, I'm now a new person and my life is full of joy and hope now. I no longer spend time thinking about the past and all the sadness and instead think mostly about my growing family and the future. I work hard to provide a good life for them and do my best to spend as much quality time with my wife and baby as I can. Well, that's awesome. It sounds like this guy is very level-headed. He now has put his life together. He's married now. He's got children. He's very happy after growing up with a lot of sadness in his life because his father abandoned him. But now, as we get into the second part of this story, you're going to see things are going to take another turn here. But before we go on with things, I want to remind you, if you liked what you've heard so far, be sure to hit the like button right now. That will help out this channel tremendously and help get this video seen across the world. Now, let's go on with part 2 of this story. He says, a couple weeks ago, something happened that brought all the pain and anguish of my childhood rushing back into focus. After finishing dinner one evening, I received a call from a woman who identified herself as Phil's wife. I was frozen silent when I heard those words. She told me Phil had been battling cancer and was back in the hospital now and wasn't doing well. Could you imagine getting that call after years of this guy being gone? Out of the blue, his wife calls you and tells you this. I didn't have a response as I was speechless and wondered why was she calling to tell me this? After all, it had been nearly 18 years since Phil left, and it took me nearly 14 years to get over him. When I asked her, she said she debated long and hard about whether she should call me or not. She said I didn't owe Phil anything, but she wanted me to know he never forgot me and still talked about me often. Those words were a surprise, and they took my breath away. He told her leaving me was the biggest regret of his life and wished he had worked something out where he could have stayed in touch with me. He told her he was pressured by his family to leave, and his lawyer advised him he needed to cut all ties or risk being financially responsible for another man's child. So remember now, this guy's mother and this Phil never got married because the families were telling them, oh no, just live together and see how things work out. So even though they weren't married, I'm sure this Phil was probably on the birth certificate. Now also think about this. This Phil couldn't have been more than like 24, 25 years old when this all went down. So this is a big decision for someone that young to make. Put yourself in his shoes. You're a young guy that age, living with this woman, getting along really well. You got a child, you think it's your child, then you find out it's not your child. What do you do? What would you do? I again asked her why she felt it necessary to call me about this. She said Phil wrote me a letter a few years ago. She said he planned to mail it to me, but never did. He kept the letter in his truck, sealed and stamped, but just couldn't bring himself to send it. She said Phil doesn't know she contacted me, but she felt I'd want to know what went on and how he felt about me. She said he really loved me and never stopped missing me. After talking to her for a few minutes, I ended up giving her my address so she could send me the letter. She thanked me for being gracious and we ended our call. After I hung up, the weight of what she told me hit me and I broke down. Momentarily, I was thrown back to the dark days of my childhood. It really messed me up, and if not for my wife, I'm not sure I'd have made it through. When the letter came, I couldn't bring myself to open it and instead had my wife open it and read it to me. Summarizing his words, Phil said he was very sorry for leaving like he did. He said it was the worst mistake of his life and he's thought about me almost every day since he left. He said he had a wife and 2 daughters now and was very happy, but still has a gaping hole in his heart that I still occupy. Yeah, I mean, you had a son for 6 years. You just can't walk away from that. I mean, you can, obviously, physically. He did that, but you can't walk away mentally. There was an old saying, and I forget who it was that came up with this saying. It went something like, wherever you go, there you are. And what that means is you can't run away from your problems. You can leave it physically. You can drive away, you can move away, but it's always going to be with you until you address the situation. He continued on saying more things like that, and by the end of the letter, both my wife and I were sobbing. I felt a rush of emotion, mostly sadness and grief, mixed with some anger towards this man. After I calmed down, I started thinking about what I'd do if this happened to me at my age. I'd like to think I'd stay, as I couldn't imagine giving up my child, but I guess you don't know what you'll do until you face something like that. And that's the truth. All of us can sit back and Monday morning quarterback and say, oh, I would have done this, I'd have done that. But you really don't know what you do until you're in the situation. And again, keep in mind, this was a very young guy. Over the next week, I threw myself into work and kept myself busy at home to keep my mind off things. My wife sensed I was hurting, even though I said I was fine. One night after work, she told me she did some research and learned Phil and his family lived just a few hours from us. She then asked if I'd like to go see him. She said if I did, she'd come with me as she'd like to meet him. She even suggested we could go that Saturday and come back on Sunday if I wanted. I told her I wasn't sure I wanted to do that as I was concerned about reopening old wounds. My wife told me she understood but wanted me to know she would be by my side to support me in whatever I wanted to do. That's just her. She's a very caring person who's always looking out for others. After thinking about it for the next week, I decided I wanted to go see Phil. I knew it would be difficult, but I had to do it for my own peace of mind. When I got home that evening, I told my wife and we discussed going that Saturday. After finishing dinner, I called Phil's wife to see if it would be okay with her. She answered and we said our hellos. After that, I told her I'd thought about it and decided I'd like to come and see Phil. She was quiet on the other end and I heard her clearing her throat. She then spoke in a low tone, saying she was sorry to have to tell me this, but Phil passed away Sunday afternoon at 1:03 p.m. Hearing those words devastated me, even though I'd not seen this man for almost 18 years. Wow, that's tough. What a really sad situation. I couldn't keep it together and started crying. I told her I was very sorry and apologized for not coming to see him right after she called. She interrupted me and said I had nothing to be sorry about and said that Phil would not want me to feel bad. She said the day after she spoke to me, Phil's health took a turn for the worse and he was going in and out of consciousness. She said during one of his lucid times she told Phil she had spoken to me and that I had accepted his letter. She said hearing that, Phil smiled and squeezed her hand, so he was aware we had connected before he passed away. Well, that's good. She said a few hours after that, Phil fell into a coma and never awakened, and he passed on Sunday surrounded by his family. So remember, this Phil left when he was like in his mid-20s, and the OP said that was 18 years ago. So he ends up dying now in his, being like 44, 45 years old. Really sad. Even though it probably shouldn't have, Phil's death impacted me like he had never left, like he was still my father. In my mind, the way I wanted things to work out is that I would visit Phil at the hospital, he would recover, and then he and I could become good friends. But our Creator had other plans for him and for me. I do feel relieved knowing his wife told him she talked to me and that I accepted his letter. I just hope he knew I still loved him and forgave him for leaving. So this OP is a hell of a guy. I mean, after going through what he went through and he's talking like that, saying, hey, he still loved the guy and forgave him, that takes a big person to do that. The OP says, he was a good man and I believe he is now among the angels. A few weeks ago, I, along with my very pregnant wife and son, traveled over to visit Phil's grave. We met up with Phil's wife at the cemetery and she led us over to his final resting place. It was very emotional for me and for all of us actually. Yeah, I can imagine. There was no gravestone yet, just a marker along with freshly laid soil covered by a mound of decaying flowers. I was able to keep it together until I saw a large ribbon across one of the bouquets. It was from Phil's daughters and it read, "Beep, beep, beep. We love you, Dad." Reading those words just destroyed me, and I lost it as that was our secret signal. After we left the cemetery, we went to a nearby restaurant and spent a couple hours talking with Phil's wife. We shared a lot of stories, and she and my wife have since become good friends over Facebook. After we got back, my wife and I told my mom about Phil's passing and everything that happened since. That was really hard as my mom has never gotten over Phil and still deeply regrets what happened all those years ago. So you see how many lives this situation impacted? Why do this? Because when the information gets out, and inevitably in most cases it's going to get out, it's going to destroy people's lives. So don't do it. Mom still carries enormous guilt for everything. While she never cheated on Phil, she admits she was highly certain I wasn't his child. So she was apparently hooking up with this guy at the mall, but then when she met this Phil, she broke things off with him and then immediately started up with Phil. Who knows if you believe that or not. When she discovered she was pregnant, she was scared and afraid of losing Phil, so she told him the child, me, was his. My entire family is totally opposed to ending pregnancies, so thankfully for me, that wasn't even a consideration. So I can see how this played out, and I can understand this woman being afraid. She's 18 years old, she gets pregnant, she's now in love with this other guy, and she knows if she tells the truth, she may lose him. So she decides to lie. And unfortunately, for everyone involved with this, it doesn't go well. Now, I don't know how she played this out. Maybe she spun that, hey, my baby came early or something like that, because this Phil should have been thinking, now, wait a minute. Now, I just started dating her here, and now this child was born here. Unless it was so close that she went from her friends with benefits to Phil the very next day. That's the only way I could think that Phil wouldn't get suspicious of the date that the kid was born. But anyway, that's how I think things played out here. And you can see by lying what it caused and how many lives were impacted by this, including her own. As I said before, I don't harbor any resentment towards my mom, as I know she's a great person. I hope one day she comes to terms with things and can forgive herself for what happened. As for me, things didn't turn out like I wanted, but at least my mind is finally at peace, and I know Phil is in a better place now. One day, hopefully many, many years from now, I look forward to meeting up with him in that better place. And that's the end of the story. And now what I want to do is take a look at what I think are the morals of the story, and then I'm going to come back at the end with some final thoughts. The first one: pregnancies that occur early in a relationship should be questioned and heavily scrutinized. If you just started dating a woman and she comes to you in a few months and says, hey, I'm pregnant, you need to look at that very closely. And I highly suggest the next point here: in these situations, you must always DNA test. I feel DNA tests should be mandatory, but especially in these situations, because you don't know who she was dating immediately before you, and you don't know what's been going on since you've been dating her. So always play it safe and DNA test. Next: cohabitating before marriage is recommended to ensure compatibility and for discovery. And what I mean by discovery is a situation like this. When you live with someone long enough, secrets and kind of nuances that they may have kept from you, they're going to come out. And then you can make the decision whether you want to continue that relationship or not. Whereas if you jump right into a marriage, you're going to be legally bound to them, and you're not going to be able to back out of it easily. Next: it's always best to tell the truth, as the cover-up is often worse than the crime. And that was clearly illustrated here. If the OP's mother had approached Phil and told him the truth, let him know, hey, I just found out I'm pregnant, and unfortunately the child isn't yours. The child belongs to this guy I was dating immediately before you, and I wanted to let you know that up front. I'm going to go forward and have this child because of my family values and my religious beliefs. This Phil might have said, okay, I'm willing to continue dating you and maybe go on and have a relationship with you, or he may have ended up leaving like he did. But that would have been better than her lying, because look at all the lives that were negatively impacted by that one lie. So it's always better to tell the truth. Next: in situations like this, it's best to tell the kids the truth in an age-appropriate way so they do not blame themselves. And that was very apparent here. The OP didn't realize for 5 years why Phil left, so initially he blamed his mother and his grandparents, but then he started blaming himself. That's why I think it's so important you sit the kids down and you tell them in an age-appropriate way. And then when they get older, you can tell them the full truth. That way they're not blaming themselves for something they had no involvement in. Next: every child needs a strong father figure in their life. And I'm going to get up on my soapbox right now. I think this is the biggest factor that has led to the degradation of society over the last 50 years. As the number of households without a father figure has increased, guess what? Society has continued to degrade. And I think the only way that's going to be remedied is if we return to traditional values where you have a mother and a father and the children living under one roof. What's happening now is just abnormal. We need to get back to a traditional household. And now finally, you can't run away from your conscience. It will follow you wherever you go. And that was definitely the case with this Phil. That void in his heart was always there, and it was always on his mind until the day he died. So remember that, folks. You need to address your problems. You can't run away from them. So those are some of the key morals of this story. And now I want to finish up with some final thoughts. First of all, to the OP, You've done nothing wrong. You were an innocent victim in this whole thing. And I applaud you for how strong you were and how you came through this. And now it's good to hear that you've got your life in order. You're married, you have children now, and it sounds like things are going well for you. And I hope things continue for you that way. And I wish you nothing but success because you deserve it. Now for Phil. That's a complicated situation. Keep in mind now, he was in his mid-20s when all this went down. I don't fault him for leaving his girlfriend over this because I very likely would have done that too. And I also don't fault him for challenging the paternity because that's a judgment call. So, no issue with that. I also wouldn't have had any problem if he decided to remain the child's legal father because I think that would have been a very noble thing to do. So, either situation there was acceptable to me. Now, the key issue I have with this whole thing is he just left without any explanation to this child. And it did so much damage to the child and to him. Now, what I think I would have done, and I have to say what I think I would have done because we never know until we're in that situation. But if it were me, I probably would have left the girlfriend. I probably would have challenged the paternity, but I would have tried to work something out where I could remain in this child's life. Maybe as a family friend, because there's no way I could have walked away from that child after raising it for 6 years. Now, I believe most attorneys would probably discourage you from doing that. They would say, hey, there's no gray area like that. You either have to leave or you have to remain the child's legal father. But I think if this Phil would have talked to the girlfriend and to the grandparents and explained that, they may have gone along with it. And then that way there wouldn't have been this negative impact on the child. But those situations can also get very sticky because eventually that girlfriend is going to go on and meet someone else, meet another guy and maybe get married or at least have a relationship. And then that makes you kind of an odd man out here. And then also what happens if the bio father comes into the child's life? It makes things complicated. But I think it would have been better if he would have remained in the child's life to some level instead of just running away. So those are my thoughts. But now I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were Phil? Would you have handled it like he did? Or would you have done something more along the lines of what I suggested? Or would you have remained the child's legal father? Tell us about that in the comments. I'm really curious to hear what the community has to say about this one. Also, be sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to this channel, and I will talk to you on the next one.